Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Jersey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, October 7th. We will hear the presentation, Client Relations for Planning Consultants, Tips to Become a Trusted Advisor. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and I will do my best to answer those. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the questions box. We will get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2022. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we're sponsored by the Private Practice Division of APA, so thanks to you all for joining us today and for pulling this session together, and you'll hear a bit more about them in a moment. Next up on your screen is a list of our remaining October webcasts. We are booked out through the end of the year for all available webcasts. In fact, we're starting to schedule some Wednesday sessions. You can see there on your screen. We do have one coming up on October 19th. You can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions by visiting ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. That's where you can register for all of our upcoming sessions. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. You can log your credits by heading over to planning.org. Log into your My APA account, and then from there you can search via title or event number. Both of those can be found also on our website. So if you're having trouble finding the session to log your credits, just head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast to get the title and the event number. And of course, if you have trouble, you can always email us at info@ohioplanning.org. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. Just search Planning Webcast and we'll pop up. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when we have new sessions available for you to register for, and I do my best to send out weekly reminders of our upcoming Friday session. And we record all of our sessions. We post them onto our YouTube channel. So just search Planning Webcasts and the YouTube search bar, and we'll pop up along with our well over 400 recordings, all available for you for free. So be sure to subscribe to our channel so that you get notified when a new session is available for you to view if you happen to miss one of our live sessions. So as a reminder, type your questions in that questions box in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and we will answer those at the end during the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen, who is representing the Private Practice Division today to kind of kick things off. And I am going to change those presenter slides over to you, Brad. So Stephen, kick us off.
Okay. Thank you, Christine. This is a webinar sponsored by the APA Private Practice Division. I'm the chair of the APA Private Practice Division. Brad, who's the speaker, is the vice chair. And this whole session more or less grew out of our monthly conversations that we host with our members. And we would encourage anyone, if you're not already a member of the Private Practice Division and you're in private practice, please join us, and we can continue to have conversations that are directly focused on practice issues, consulting issues on a monthly basis. This one started out as a conversation on client relations in June, and Brad took it over and expanded it into a webinar. In addition to monthly conversations, we also have a private practice networking group, which the login information is there, and you can exchange ideas, network, search for consulting partners. There are a lot of services available to consultants, but you have to be a member of our division to access the planners networking group or the consultants networking group. And we also have a private practice planning handbook, which is available to members, and the dues are only $25. So you can think of it as paying $25 for the handbook and you got your membership for free. Either way, we got you as a member and we want to have you. We have mainly, most of our members are small practitioners. We do also have members who work in architecture and engineering firms, but there are so many different aspects of consulting, and there are very few planning schools that prepare you for private practice. They can tell you all about planning, but a lot of this stuff you have to learn on the fly. And Brad and I both learned a lot on the fly that you're going to hear today, so that you don't have to go through what we went through. And we encourage you to ask questions and learn as much as you can. And anything you want to do to follow up, join our division and we can talk about this some more. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Brad, and he's going to actually lead you through what is a great and informative session. Everything I wish I knew before I became a private practice planner, and hopefully it's never too late to learn. Take it away, Brad.
All right, thanks, Steve. So as Steve mentioned, we have conversations with different planners. We have a survey and so forth, and these are some of the ideas we've heard to feature in future webinars or conversations, such as this PPD consultant manual that was done, I think, in 2014, and it's now going through an update. Steve and I are a couple of the authors on chapters there. Some of these things we'll talk about a little bit today: cultivating clients and securing contracts or different types of contracts, and how do you market. We have a whole chapter 3 in the handbook on marketing and adding in a lot of information post-COVID and social networking and so forth. So how do you market your private practice, whatever level you are? Or how do you deal with equity, sustainability, resiliency, and other things in master plans? How do you team with engineers, architects, attorneys, or even other planners? We found our networking group really is valuable for people to work with other disciplines or specialists in housing or transportation or something else. And I think the private practice division can be a really good networking opportunity with you as some other planners, in addition to people in other professions. So these are some potential topics that have come up. We did a survey of members, and it identified a few other topics for either a webinar or for a conversation. So if you're really interested in a particular topic, if you could add that to the chat so Christine can see that. And if you're interested in being a volunteer on one of these topics, let us know that as well. So today's session is client relations. We felt that this is something that comes up in all of our monthly conversations, and this is kind of an outline of what we want to do. And this is based, again, Brad Strader from MKSK. I'll talk about myself in a minute, but this is kind of based on my own personal experience. And if I had a do-over when I was 25, things I wish I had known. But also, I've had a lot of input from conversations with Steve and our committee members, and at these monthly conversations, and other people at my firm, MKSK, and some other consultants I've worked with to help put this together. So I want to thank Kevin Miller here, who's helping me today and help put the presentation together, and all of those that helped put the outline and information together. So some of the things we're going to talk about today is how do you make consulting interesting? How do you make it fun and interesting? So I've been a consultant most of my career. I love being a consultant, even though it can be a bit stressful at times. We're going to talk a little bit about that. How do you become a trusted advisor? How do you build relationships with your client? What kind of agreement do you need to have? Is it formal, informal? The kind of the pros and cons of how you price your work. What are some of the tips to communicate with clients? Again, it depends on the client type and your personality and so forth, but we got, I guess, some suggestions here. One of the things that most consultants run into is scope creep, and what is scope creep, and how do you, maybe have some tips to avoid scope creep. And then you'll hear this throughout the work is getting paid for your work. Is some of these monthly conversations we have, people said, well, I'm starting a business, how do I get paid? At what point do you quit giving away work as pro bono and start getting paid? So a little bit of background on me. So I'm in MKSK's Detroit office. I'm the principal in charge. I'm a planner. I graduated from Michigan State. I've got many years, I guess, of experience. I've worked on well over 400 projects of various types. So comprehensive plans, master plans, downtown studies, neighborhood plans, parking studies, zoning ordinances and form-based codes, all types of transportation, TOD and interchange studies and NEPA studies and PEL studies and network modeling and non-motorized plans and so forth. So I've had the fortune to work in a lot of different fields with a lot of other experts, and I think hopefully I can share some of that knowledge today and some of the things I've learned working with other excellent planners and people in other disciplines. I do a lot of instruction for the Institute of Transportation Engineers, a little bit for ITE, the Michigan Association of Planning, APA here in Michigan, but also some of the other state chapters, Virginia and some other places. And so I work at MKSK, where we have offices, 12 offices in a lot of different states. We have about 25, 26 planners at MKSK. We're a landscape architecture firm, primarily with about 110, 112 employees. So we work with that discipline. Prior to my joining MKSK and starting the Detroit office about 7 years ago, I was president of a planning firm for about 20 years, where we started with 3 of us, and we quickly grew to 25 planners working all across the United States, in Alaska, and Texas, and Virginia, and the Carolinas, and Georgia, and so forth. So I think that was some experience I'm bringing forward today. Prior to starting my own firm with others, I was the chief of operations for another planning firm that grew from 8 or 10 people to 35 people. So go through these cycles of growth and stagnation with the economy. So I've gone through all of those up and down cycles. I started out my career at an MPO, and then was part of the planning, landscape architecture, and civil engineering group with a fairly large architects and engineering firm. So a lot of background in different types of firms, but most of my career has been as a consultant. So I'm going to talk a little bit about client relations and why they're important. First of all, if you're starting out or considering starting out a sole proprietor practice, or if you're a student considering what are the pros and cons of consulting, or if you have a small business and you want to grow your practice, or you're the planner for an engineering firm or an architectural firm, how do you grow that practice within your organization, or maybe having some of your own work? So that's why client relations are important. If you're going to have business, and if you're going to grow the business, client relations are the way to grow that business. I think client relations are really important to build your reputation. A lot of the work can be through your reputation with other organizations, other planners, and so forth. I think client relations are really important for job satisfaction and enjoyment. So a lot of my public sector clients are brilliant. I love their ideas, but they haven't really shared them with others. And sometimes they just want validation that their ideas should be considered and promoting. So there's a lot of job satisfaction of working with planners in other fields, or working with engineers and architects and landscape architects and marketing people and other attorneys, all these allied professions, that really makes the job of consulting a lot more interesting and fun. Because for me, these have become personal relations. A lot of the communities I've worked with over the years, I've worked with for 20 or 30 years, building great personal relationships with them, and it's just made the job of consulting thrilling and exciting. It gets you through those kind of the low periods where bad public hearings or something like that. So it's really, it can be a stress relief to just have a satisfaction of working with great clients and great people. So what are clients looking for when they hire a consultant? So these are just some of the things that you've probably heard or would hear. Sometimes the client will hire you because of your special expertise. Maybe you're a specialist in housing or transportation or zoning or something else, or they just know that you're knowledgeable. Or you've worked with a lot of other communities, so you're bringing that knowledge to them, and I think that's important. Sometimes consultants get hired because they think the consultants can remain poised when dealing with the public, or unruly applicants, or maybe officials that aren't going to listen to their own planners. Maybe they don't respect their own planners, and they just want a source that's outside, or to support what the public sector planner has told them. I think sometimes consultants get hired because they think you always have good answers. You can get things done. Sometimes architects and engineers and so forth think we're not exactly sure what planners do, but you seem to know a little bit about everything and can either give us an answer or help us get an answer or find somebody else to answer that questions. And then I think have recommendations that are respected. So I've been fortunate. I think I have great clients, great projects, and really feel respected in the profession. And I think sometimes people that are planners don't feel that respect. And I think, you know, my experience as a consultant, you probably get a greater level of respect than you might in some public sector situations. So how do you get hired? This isn't really the focus of today, but one of the things to have high relations is how to get hired. And some of this is in the PPD handbook. But how do you get hired? How do you find great clients? Because the goal, right, is not just to have work and interesting projects, but to do work that's exciting and finding great clients that you can have a great relationship with. So I think for me personally, a lot of it's been reputation, and this somewhat comes with years of experience, but I got a lot of work right out of school in my early and mid 20s. So you don't have to have a lot of your experience to get skill set based on reputation. The goal sometimes is to get sole source clients where they just reach out to you and you don't have to have competitive responses to RFPs or RFQs, but they just reach out to you and say, can you do this? Can you do that? A lot of work that I get as attorneys calling or engineers or architects calling and saying, hey, can you work with this on a particular project? As you start building up work, you're going to get referrals from your key clients at other towns and agencies and firms. So that's always helpful. Speaking at conferences like this kind of webinar or speaking at national conferences, I think can help you get great clients. One of my colleagues at a prior firm and I were speaking at the APA conference in Denver years ago, and somebody afterward from Alaska came up and said, boy, we really like what you're talking about. We think people from Michigan would be a great fit for Alaska. Would you guys work in Alaska? And we kind of thought, Alaska, that's a long way away. And we said, sure. So we put in a proposal and not expecting to get hired. And we were hired in Alaska and started doing work in Alaska. And it all came up from us speaking at an APA conference and saying the right things that people resonated with. A lot of work in the handbook is responding to RFPs and RFQs, and you can see chapter 4 of the consultant handbook if you don't have it yet, but that's part of it too. So this is a competitive response. Sometimes you need to team up with other planners or other allied professions, but sometimes getting work is from responding to RFPs and RFQs. Authoring articles and books or posting things on a website is another way to sort of get your name known, get your opinions known, and build up your reputation. So I guess the key thing on this is my experience is repeat clients are easier than finding new clients. So throughout my work, I've brought in new clients and new work, but a lot of my work has been repeat clients or referrals from others. So from that, we're gonna pause for a minute and ask you a question. So here's the question. What is the average hit rate for an RFP, RFQ without a relationship? And to respond to this, you can either use the QR code on the right or go to www.menti.com, enter this code and answer that question. So we'll give you a couple minutes to look at that. And I know if some of you have used menti.com, some haven't. I was speaking at the Wisconsin APA conference maybe 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, and they brought up menti.com, and that's been just a really nice tool to use at some of the public workshops we have to get a quick response of things.
I'm also putting it in the chat box for everybody, the link and also the code. So if you move on to folks who didn't get a chance to write it down or log in, it's in your chat.
All right, we'll wait just a minute. Check. All right, let's see what our response is. All right, the average hit rate for an RFP, RFQ, this is from a couple different sources. Let's see what the results are. 15 seconds. 10 seconds. And I think this will reinforce. So, I have a personal hit rate, and we use a lot of, I think we're trying to be selective to go after things that we really think we have a good chance to win, but sometimes you go after a proposal and there's 12 or 15 submittals, and you put in all this time on a proposal, and you ask the client afterward, how much time did you spend on each proposal? And they say 3 minutes. If you put in weeks and, lots of effort and so forth. So the answer is 10 to 20% is the typical hit rate for an RFP, RFQ. And sometimes it's even lower if there's a lot of instructions. So I think most of you kind of got that correct. So this is one advantage, I think, of working with ongoing clients, that you don't have to compete with, you're only going to win 10, 20% of the time, maybe less than that if you're going after a new client, especially if you don't have a relationship or you can't really ask questions about them to make sure you know what their expectations are. So how do you build and maintain client relations? How do you become a trusted advisor? We use that term here at MTSK quite a bit. And it really depends on the type of client. So in the public sector, when you're working for like a city or a town or a county, if you're doing ongoing work, they're really wanting people that are innovative, can solve problems quickly, maybe the ability to facilitate or be diplomatic. If you're doing public sector projects like zoning ordinances or comprehensive plans, they're really looking at the knowledge you bring in from other places. Maybe there's particular topics on sustainability or multimodal or mixed use or housing types or affordable housing that you are an expert in that they are not. So they bring you in because of that knowledge, this kind of specialized knowledge. Maybe you're very organized, or they look for consultants that are very organized in how to get something that's delivered, because maybe the town staff has wanted to work on a comprehensive plan or zoning ordinance and they just can't get around to it, or they don't really know how to go from A to Z, and so they bring in the consultants to do that, and they look at you as a trusted advisor because they expect you are going to get the project done on time. If you're working with developers and attorneys, and about 10% of my work is work with developers and attorneys. I've worked with 2 developers for over 20 years, where I've worked on all kinds of projects with them and worked with their attorneys and really enjoyed that work. I think sometimes working in the private sector, work with developers really had made me a better public sector planner as well. So developers and attorneys are looking for your responsiveness. They expect quick responses. The developers I work with will call me on the weekend or any time of the day. They want you to be prepared. They want you to go to meetings and be unflappable. They want you to really, support their position. So you got to be careful when you're working with developers and attorneys, because if you have a developer attorney and it goes sour, that can really affect your reputation. So for me, I've had to be very selective on which developers and attorneys to work with. If you're working with an agency like a county or a road commission or a DOT or an environmental agency, they're often looking for efficiency, documentation, checking off the boxes for all the things that need to be prepared. As a couple members of PPD members at one of the workshops we had said, federal work is very different. So this doesn't really talk about client relations with federal work and getting qualified in advance and so forth, pre-qualified, but federal work is also, very different and has some different set of criteria. And then working with other firms, architects, engineers, planners, landscape architects, other planning firms, they're often looking for collaboration, that you're bringing something to the project that adds value, or maybe in some cases they bring the planner in because you're very organized and you can listen to other viewpoints from other organizations and departments and specialists and help come up with a unified position. So those are some of the things that when you're working as a consultant, becoming a trusted advisor is very important, but you need to understand that what those clients are looking for may vary, as shown here on this list. So how do you build a relationship with a client? Again, this is kind of my experience, but also input from others putting this together. I think being timely, prompt, and responsive is like the key thing there, right? I think with a lot of clients, especially if you work with them a long time, is really anticipating in advance what they're going to be looking for and being ready with a response. Know the why, as the APA often says, know what the community or the public and so forth, what they're asking for. Go to a lot of public hearings, and sometimes the planning commission or the board or council doesn't really hear the question, or maybe the question isn't asked very well, and maybe the staff doesn't quite hear the question, and sometimes you just independently need to interpret the question so that you can ask the engineer the question, or ask the planner, or ask the council, and kind of interpret from the audience or different disciplines in a way that other people can understand. I really think it's important to know your stuff, or if you don't know the answer, who to ask. A lot of credit you get is having organized deliverables, things that are clear and readable, memorable presentations that aren't overdone, great graphics. I think great graphics, I really enjoy working for MKSK in part because we just have great graphics. Put a lot of emphasis on urban design and great graphics, and a few great graphics can much easily replace pages and pages of text and charts and stuff that nobody quite understands and reads into, but great graphics can really get the point across. And then I think you need to have communications, and there can be scheduled formal communications. It could be bi-weekly meetings or monthly meetings or live meetings, but also some informal conversations. It could just be a phone call. It could be the time that we kind of lost this in COVID to a degree, when we're all doing Zoom meetings and so forth, but this informal conversation before a meeting or after a meeting, that informal conversation can really help build the project that you're working on. And it can also be personally fulfilling to really get to know the client and appreciate them, and they can appreciate you a little bit more. So that's how you build, I think, client relations. Another important thing with client relations is having a clear work plan or a scope of work. So this would be if you're doing a zoning ordinance or comprehensive plan or neighborhood plan or corridor plan. Well, almost every project you do as a consultant, you need to have a clear understanding of what they're looking for. If you're going after these RFPs and RFQs, you need to decide what kind of proposal do you need. Again, if it's a 10% or whatever percentage of winning, sometimes you need a marketing proposal that has, you write it as a marketing thing. They really sell yourself and your ideas and so forth, and maybe you don't get into all the details of how many meetings and deliverables and all the things you need in there, versus a detailed work plan, which I tend to prefer, which gets into the details. Say, here's the deliverable by milestone or something. Here's how many maps we're going to do. Here's how many graphics we're going to do. Here's how many meetings by types and so forth. And you'll have to decide, depending on the RFP, the client and so forth, if you want a marketing type proposal or a detailed work plan proposal or a combination. But for me, if you're doing a marketing type proposal, then you need to be really careful to avoid vague terms that could be debated later. It would be terms like all meetings as necessary or as needed, or we'll provide whatever data is needed and so forth. So if you have vague terms, at some point, somebody's going to go back to the work plan and say, well, we expected this, we expected that. Existing land use, we're going to do an existing land use. Well, how many categories, how detailed, how often are you going to update it? Some of that information, just be careful, be thinking, how's somebody going to interpret this in the future, because you'll run into cases, because I've run into cases where people later go back and say, well, your proposal, your interview said that you would do this, and I'm interpreting it differently. So just put that lens on when you're looking at your proposal. Precise schedule, what's going to be done, how many deliverables or milestones at different milestones, how many maps, how many pages maybe you're expecting, how many meetings with the planning commission, with the council, with the staff meeting, and so forth. If you're a sub-consultant to a prime consultant, look at how many meetings. I've worked on several big transportation projects where the prime comes back and say, all right, we're going to have a weekly team meeting to go through this. So we're going to have pre-meetings before the meeting with the client. Well, that was never in my scope. That was never in my budget, and that eats up a lot of time. So if you're a sub-consultant working with a prime, be sure to understand how often are you going to meet with them? How much do you need to document? How many changes are you going to make? Maybe they want 3 sets of revisions before it even goes to the client. So be thinking about that when you put a work plan together, or a scope of work, or a sub-agreement with the prime. Describing client communications, that could be with the prime, if you're a sub-consultant, or with the community. Are these going to be bi-weekly meetings? Are they going to be live meetings? Are they going to be virtual meetings and so forth? What do you expect the client to do? Do you expect the client to set up the meetings? Are they going to do notices? Are they going to collect all the information from the planning commission and put it on in nice condensed deliverable back to you, or network or markup? Or are they just going to give you, here's 15 or 20 markups with all things you can't read and all inconsistent, and they expect you to address all that? So you might want to know what you expect the client to do, and if you're going to get input from the client, that they have to go in and combine all those comments into one and get it back to you. And if there's debates or inconsistent, maybe you have a meeting there, a meeting with the community or the planning commission or with the staff to go through that and have them agree on the changes, instead of you getting stuck in the middle of debate between departments or with planning commissioners. And then just be careful to what is and isn't included, which we'll talk about in a minute with scope creep. So those are some ideas to get started. The last thing before you get started is sort of working on the contract thing. So sometimes you've been hired. They call you and they want to hire you, or you've been selected from your proposal and they want to get started, but sometimes it takes a while to get the contract approved. So, and they might ask you to get started. So my recommendation is, if they want you to get started, you want an authorization to proceed in writing. It could be an email. If they do it verbally, I would ask that they provided an email or a letter and just say, while we're working on the contract, these are the things that we have agreed upon for you to get started on, and here's the fee that we can do, or you can bill up to this amount. So some kind of a written authorization before the contract is approved. Then when you're getting started, and we've had this come up at some of our conversations, how do you determine the hourly rate and so forth, and how do you bill? Well, first of all, if you're doing hourly, you need to consider overhead costs and marketing time and administrative time, maybe the profit margin. What's your profit margin? Is it 10%, 15%, whatever it is? And if you're a sole proprietor with one or two planners, or a planner and admin staff, be thinking ahead. What if you kind of grow the business and be thinking ahead and adding staff? You want to kind of set it up that you can grow into that contract and not have to reconsider. You don't want to start out with a really low overhead cost, not making much money, and then have to raise it in a year or two. So consider, be thinking 2 to 3 or 5 years ahead when you put these this cost together. And then there's different types of contracts. There's hourly not to exceed, there's hourly with or without expenses, there's fixed fee or lump sum. Lump sum is whatever it is, however many meetings and so forth, we're going to get this amount of money for this task, and expenses are included. So just make sure you understand how you're billing the time and have it set up that way, and how our expenses are handled. If you're handling expenses, is it going to be hourly or the fixed fee plus expenses? What kind of information do you need on expenses? Do you need receipts? What kind of detail on expenses? Because that can be kind of burdensome if you have to have a lot of expenses. So if they want a lot of detail on expenses, you might want to increase your overhead for that type of client. There's some projects, like with DOT, they're kind of slow to pay. And so in those, they will even let you add like 1 or 2% to the fee, because they know it's like time is money, and they know they're going to take a long time to pay, so you can add that. So be thinking about that. And there are some times when you want a retainer. So with public sector, they may say, we don't like the inconsistency. They want a predictable retainer. Here's how much we're going to pay every month for your services, and then you got to kind of track it. Or if you're working with a developer, especially if you've not worked with a developer before, you might want to get a retainer and say, we require 4,000 or 5,000, whatever the amount is. We need this upfront before we even get started, and we will return that to you once we're done with the project. So you're not sending them an invoice and then hoping to get paid. So, and then understanding the invoice schedule. So if you send out your invoice to the client on the 5th of the month, but they pay every 1st of the month, you've lost like 30 days. So understand the invoice schedule, what time you need to get the invoice in, who needs to approve it, and maybe adjust your schedule to meet that client, especially if it's a big fee project. And then client communications are really important. What do you do in client communications, these weekly calls or however you're going to do it? If you're, let's say it's a bi-weekly call or monthly call, or maybe it's just a quick report, doesn't need to be necessarily elaborate, but maybe you want to track what was done, clarify any issues that have come up or things you expect from the client, what's coming up now, information you need from a different department head or somebody else on the team. Highlight any issues and responses, especially if you have a lot of engagement going on. You might want to talk on that, or you might even want to have a separate conversation on engagement on bigger projects. And then agree to any changes to the work plan. Just go back to the work plan, and if they're saying other things have come up, then this is a good time at these regular meetings, or maybe you put it on the invoice or something and say, this change is requested, this would be a change to the work plan, and here's how we're going to address it. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. And then if I'm having a conversation or a meeting, I think quick meeting notes are helpful. I don't think you need, I don't do verbatim minutes. I do a one page, here's who was there, here's what was discussed, and then here's the actions that are going to be done by when and by whom. I think that's just a good, easy documentation to put together. So then once you've done that, get the contract, understand expenses and everything else, how do you do the work? So this is where consulting can be kind of difficult. When I've talked to people that have been a consultant that go back to the public sector, and I say, what do you miss the least? And they say the timesheet, just the pressure of doing the timesheet when you're a consultant. And here's some examples of why the timesheet can be high pressure. You have all these 5-minute calls. Call you at 10 o'clock, call you at 2:30, call you at 5:45 in the evening, and it's 5-minute calls, maybe throughout the day, and it kind of disrupts your day, but 5-minute calls, how do you build that time? It's only 5 minutes. Do you track your time by 10 minutes or 15 minutes or half-hour interval? How do you do 5-minute calls? What if there's 3 5-minute calls? What if there's a 5-minute call throughout the day? So that can eat up a lot of time, and you have to decide when and how you build it. What if you have a 20-minute call with a client you have a really good relationship with, them, like half the time is just kind of catching up. So it's 10 minutes of work, 10 minutes of just, enjoyable time. Do you bill 10 minutes? Do you bill none of that time? Do you bill the 20 minutes? You have to be thinking about that. What about the client who calls for a quick task? And you and she think that that's going to be like a 15-minute, 30-minute task, and it turns into 4 hours. Well, maybe you should have said, hey, this is taking longer. This is going to be a 4 to 6 hour task before you proceed. Or maybe they expected it would be a freebie and it's in 4 hours. How do you build that time? What if you're meeting with an official? So I put into the contracts that we will have one client contact. So we can't have planning commissioners or council members calling me individually, but some of them still do. So how do you build that unofficial time with an official? Do you build that time? How do you build your project management time? It can take a lot of time, the administrative time to write out invoices, especially if they want a lot of detail. There's project management time if you're a sub-consultant dealing with a prime. If you're the prime and you have sub-consultants, that's project management time. And if you add all these kind of things up, it can turn a 40-hour week into 60+ hours, but you can only bill 24. So as you're putting things together, you really need to look at when you shut off the spigot. When is time billable? You might need to let the client know and so forth. But these are things as a consultant you really need to be thinking about, so you don't end up only able to bill 24 hours and you've worked 60, 70 hours a week. So. And that kind of leads to scope creep. All those little things are what is scope creep. So what are scope creep? These are adding new tasks or topics without being paid. So one example would be like shown on the left here is you're doing a downtown plan or a corridor plan. They say, oh, we just want to expand the corridor. We want to add in this new area. We have a new annexation coming in. We just want to broaden the area. So that's a lot of extra work, but they don't think it's a lot of extra work. So how do you deal with that? What if they liked your work plan, your scope of work, and they approve it, but you were in for $150,000 and they only have $120,000. And they say, well, we want the same work plan, but for a lesser budget. So how do you work that through? Do you revise the work plan? Do you reduce the level of detail? Do you accept it? So that's another thing you'll have to think about. What if they request more data, surveys, analysis, update? A couple examples, if you're doing existing land use and it's 2020 and you did existing land use, now you're in 2022 and you're finishing up the plan and they say, oh, we want to go back and redo existing land use. A lot of things have changed. I would put in the contract that once we have the existing land use done or any other deliverable, they sign off, and any updates on that are going to have to be additional services. Or another example, that every 10 years, I forget this, the census comes out. So the 2020 census comes out, and we did our demographic analysis and everything else like a year ago, and they said, oh, we're almost done with the plan. Can you just update all the demographic information to use this new census information that came out? And I forgot again, and all these new projects, and go back, if you're going to be into a census period, you want to say, we're going to use the data available at the time, and any updates later are an extra service. So that's a lesson learned that I didn't remember. What if they want to add a new topic or meeting? You have a public workshop and they say, well, DEI, diversity is really important, or equity is important, or we need something on sustainability. And like, oh, can you just add that new topic, or can you add a new chapter? Or can you go meet with these other stakeholders? What if there's endless revisions? They have all these comments and they want to have endless revisions, or they've been slow to respond. You get the draft together, you've been waiting and waiting, and then you get last minute revisions from the client. Or what if there's a transition time, that city manager changes, or the council changes, or the mayor changes, or your project manager client moves on to another position in the community or moves out of the community, and you've got transition time. How do you build that? So these things should be thought about when you're putting the proposal together, especially on the contract, and determine when can you bill for these extra services. And it's really on when to be flexible. Sometimes those things come up and you say, hey, I've got some flexibility in the budget. Yes, we can include that. And if you're going to include it, get it in writing. Or you could say, no, this is outside the scope, but here's what we can do. Let's swap tasks, or let's put less detail on this. Do you agree? And we'll add detail here. Or maybe you send a fee amendment and say, hey, these are extra things. We know they're important, and here's what we can do to amend the fee and schedule. If you're going to do that, you want to know the process and so forth. But as you're looking at these scope creep opportunities that are going to come up, be thinking about how you want to deal with them. And how do you propose additional services? So I think it's really important to be upfront on what is included in the scope and what isn't included. You could run through these at the kickoff meeting or have a list. Sometimes you do a style guide meeting with the client, agree on the format and so forth to get that set up right at the beginning of the project. And some projects we put together at MKSD a separate agreement for extra services right off the bat. Hey, extra things might come up, so here is an ongoing agreement for extra services. So if they ask for something, say, oh, great, we have this extra services agreement, we'll just bill to that. Or it's a separate purchase agreement or something else. You might want to clarify that process in the contract, or know what that process is and what approval is needed. I've worked on some projects where we have a contingency budget. So we set aside like 10% that can be used, mutually agreed upon by the client and by you, to say, all right, this is extra services and we've got a contingency budget that we can move into. So these are, I guess, some tips for additional services, but there are going to be times you just say, you know, we just can't do that. And you've got to be prepared to just say no, and it depends on the client. So, you know, some of my clients used to be consultants. Sometimes somebody who is a consultant are very understanding. Sometimes former consultants are the worst client because they must have had a bad consulting experience, because they think you're just made of money, and so you really understand the kind of the background of the client. But there are times when you just say, we just can't do that. All right, so that leads to getting paid, right? You've done all these tips, so you have no scope creep and everybody's hunky-dory, right? So then how do you get paid? So these are some things we've heard, and some of our committee members have said. One is, especially if you're working as a sub-consultant, we pay you when we get paid. So you avoid that by saying we get paid in 15 days or 30 days. What if they didn't get your invoice in time? What if they didn't process your invoice because they were slow to get the process going, or they missed your invoice or something? So I try to avoid we pay you when we get paid. Sometimes you can't avoid that. Or we'll have a client say, hey, you're charging me. I thought this was pro bono. We've had this come up on some of our PPD conversations. Where do you kind of draw the line where they know it's not pro bono? I had a partner at a previous firm that did lots of pro bono work, and everybody just thought they could just call him anytime for questions and he would never bill them. He was too timid to bill. Well, you need to know when you can bill. Or you hear from the client, well, your rate is too high, or this took way too long, let's negotiate. I don't want to have to pay for that. Or if you're working for a developer, they might say, well, thanks for all your help, but our project wasn't approved, so we can't pay you. But they, if your project was approved, they don't give you a bonus. So this is where if you're working with a developer, you might want to have a retainer to make sure that you're getting paid, even if the project's not approved. So what are some things that you do? Again, invoicing terms and conditions, make sure it's clear when things are in the scope or not in the scope. They have a process for who approves additional services. What level of detail do you need on the invoice or this weekly contract? The payment schedule. I've had a few clients have said, well, we're going to withhold 10% of the payment until we're done. So I usually don't even go after any project like that, because you never know what their attitude would be or how they make a decision on when to pay you. But be aware of a payment schedule and how the repercussions of that, if they at the end they just don't want to pay you that extra 10% or something. And then when and how to raise rates. This is especially true if you're doing ongoing work. So kind of my experience over the years is just it's better to update the rate annually, a small amount every year, rather than wait 5 or 7 years and then do a big pay raise. Because if you do that, then you're going to say, well, this is a big jump, let's go out to bid again. So my advice is raise regularly, but I know a lot of people don't do that. But anyway, that's my advice. So what are tips to avoid client problems? This is a good one from the PPD manual, is how to assess a good opportunity from those that are not. This goes into a go, no go process, which projects do you want to go after and so forth. So you really need to assess a good opportunity from those that are not. And that's not just the type of work and type of community, but even the client or the project manager. Is this somebody we're going to really enjoy working with and be a good partner, or is this person just too busy or not attentive or going to be difficult to work with? Don't just rely on one-on-one communication, because your project manager could get ill during COVID or move on to another position, or so you want to work with the city manager too, or the attorney or the department head, or another planner on staff, or build up a relationship also with the administrative staff there. They can be really helpful to track people down and let you know what's going on. So I really think getting to know the administrative person at a department or in a planning department is just as important as getting to know the planners. Staying in your lane. I think I've really expanded what I do, and a lot of us expand what we do from what we're learning. So I think staying in your lane doesn't mean you can't try new things, but sort of stay within your lane, and know that in some cases you might want to build a relationship with collaborative partners in your firm or other firms or other planning firms or attorneys. Bring them in for some work, they'll bring you in for some work. So I think that that's important. A lot of my work, 80% of my work has been working with people in other allied professions or previous relationships. Understand there's different viewpoints. So if you're working with the planning staff, you have an economic development staff, they might not agree with the planner, or the engineers may not agree with the planner. So understand their viewpoints, and sometimes the planner ends up being the facilitator to facilitate compromises. You need to know when to be an advocate. So I've worked in some communities where they didn't want sidewalks or pathways, and I really pushed and pushed and pushed. And then later they get awards for being the most walkable city in the Midwest, or one of the most walkable cities in America. And it only took one vote of the Planning Commission or Council to get those pathway projects in, where you do a survey of residents and they say, the #1 reason we live here is because we have sidewalks or pathways. But 15 years ago, the officials said, well, we don't want sidewalks or pathways, we're rural. And you know when to advocate and when not to be an advocate. So be thinking about that too. So some of the key takeaways I think that I would suggest from putting this together is it's always easier to keep a current client happy and give you more work than competing for a new client. Not meaning you can't go after new clients and expand your business and so forth, but there have been a lot of commercials just saying keep those current clients happy, because that's the best thing to do, right? Your reputation can be your best asset. So that certainly worked for me, and I think a lot of PPD members is your reputation. Pick projects that you can take on, that you know how to do the work, that you can do well, and that you have the capacity to do. Don't take on work that you can't do because you don't have the expertise or you don't have the capacity, or bring in other team members to do that. I think that a clear scope, whether it's in the proposal or the contract, is better than an informal arrangement, but But I'd say when I worked for this firm where we worked for about 70 communities on an ongoing basis, and half of them we had a formal agreement, half of them informal, and sometimes the informal clients paid better and were more reliable than those where we had a contract. So informal can be okay, but just be aware there's a little bit more risk if there's an informal arrangement. Client communications, which we talked about today, is really important. I think the key thing is if you have the luxury that I think I've had the fortune to have is pick great clients and great projects. Not all of them are great, but most of them are. And then really enjoy being a consultant. I think it's a great opportunity to be a consultant. You can learn a lot of things with consultant. I find like every day to be rewarding. I work with some great people that have gone on to become city managers and planning directors and done great things. And I take a lot of pride that I've worked with great people and helped build their careers. And I work with a lot of great clients that have helped build my career as well. So with that, thank you, and turn it back to Christine for any questions.
Great. Yeah, folks, again, just as a reminder, type those questions into the chat box and we'll see how many we can get to here. So, all right, let's just dive right in. The first question is a little bit logistical. Where can we locate a copy of the consultant handbook? I know you mentioned that you're updating it, but just curious.
Steve, do you want to give a response to that one?
Hold on a second here. You can hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. We will make if you join a division, send me an email and I'll send you a copy of the handbook. And if you're already a member of the division, then you don't, just send me an email and we'll go straight to go. I keep a current roster, so if you've joined since in the last month or so, we'll just take your word for it. But yeah, the handbook is still very valuable in relation to what we're going to be doing when we update it, because it covers a lot of brass tacks and basics that aren't going to change that much over time. So,
and I think the new handbook is about 80% done. We've had a lot of volunteers, and if somebody's really interested in looking at a preview of a particular chapter or the whole handbook and giving some input, you could let Steve know that too, because I think we're kind of in the last few weeks of putting the new handbook together. So if somebody's really interested in looking that over before we finalize it, let us know that too.
Okay, and yeah, we always need volunteers. So even if you're already a member of the division, we encourage you to reach out to us and tell us what you'd like to do to make the division more successful. But the handbook is our main thing, and we'd be glad to get a copy to you. Even happier to make you a member.
Okay, so we have some ethics related questions, which I think comes up a lot in the private consulting world. And the first one comes with the idea of long-standing relationships with clients. And is it okay for a community, just a planner, to hire a consultant because they've known them for a long time? You know, let's say you were the planner worked for a different community and you were their consultant for years and years, and now the planner has moved on to another community. Can that planner really ethically just say, you know what, we're just going to hire this person because I know him and he's great and I love his team? Is that okay, or should there be a more formal process?
So I guess I can speak from my experience. It's been both. A lot of the communities I work with are because the planner or city manager went from one community to another, and we had a good trusted relationship, and they just brought me in. Other times they said, hey, I've got to go out to an RFP. It really kind of depends on the community attitude, but I'd say half the time they go to an RFP, half the time they've just brought me in. Some communities say anything over a certain amount that they have to have a competitive bidding process. So it really kind of depends.
And this one has come up, this next question has come up in many ways across our platform here, particularly during ethics sessions. And it is, what if what if a planner that you're working with is trying to sidestep things that they shouldn't? For example, in the RFP, there's a whole section on community engagement. But then, the planner in charge at the community is like, you know what, we're just going to skip over that, or we're going to augment it so that a very specific group of community members is going to participate. How do you handle that? How do you deal with that as the consultant?
Yeah, so that's a good question. At the APA session in San Diego, at the ethics session, there were a lot of questions about, if I'm working for community A, can I work in the community next door? And kind of a lot of it is gray area, right? So you'll have to make the decision as a consultant. If the city manager says, we want you to recommend approval here, I don't care if you're doing an independent review, then I want you to approve this, or I want you to deny this. So when I've worked with another firm, we had an agreement that we would have an independent review. We'd put in the contract, we would do an independent review, and we're not going to be changing our opinion because of the city manager or the city planner had to change their opinion. We would say, hey, if there's something we missed, if there's information you have, we'll consider it and consider revising our opinion, but we aren't going to change our opinion because you favor or disfavor that developer. So the consultant would have to make that call. If this is an important client to you, and because you could be dismissed by that client. My firm was dismissed by client that we wouldn't change our recommendation to what the city manager wanted because it was inconsistent with the plan and so forth. So another planning consultant came in and recommended approval, even though it was inconsistent with the plan. So it's a gray area for a consultant to decide. Public involvement is kind of interesting because a lot of time the public doesn't want change. So if you're just dealing with the public, we have a lot of debates at the planners in Michigan about how much do you let the public influence, because I think the public is very important aspect of planning. But if the plan is just a representation of what the public wants, things aren't going to change very much for the better. And you have to kind of take the balance of public input and your private sector experience and say, putting it together, here's what we recommend. And you as a planning consultant will have to make that decision. If the planner if the scope says we're going to pay attention to public engagement and the planning commission expects public engagement and the planning director says we're going to ignore all that, I think you need to have a communication with the planning director or diplomatically bring it up at the planning commission. The public said this is kind of the response we're going to get. But you have to make the decision. It's kind of that gray area.
When it comes to going after projects, do you prefer, and actually I should say, do you really think there is a difference between a request for qualifications and a request for proposals? And when it comes to proposals, how much do you actually include as to, not sort of give up everything that you would do under the proposal, particularly if you don't get it? They could potentially just take your proposal and say, oh, well, this is a great scope. I love this. We're not going to use them, but I'm going to use their proposal for what I do want. So again, this is sort of a two-part question. One, your thoughts on the difference between an RFP and an RFQ, and do you go after one more than the other? Does it say something about the community when they pick one or the other? And then two, how do you make sure that you don't present too much information in an RFP?
Yeah, those are all good questions. So there's almost like 3 layers. So there's RFQ, request for qualifications, where you might write a introduction to the project or something, or understanding, but very limited, and include a resume, some similar projects and so forth. And that's a request for qualifications. And the communities that do that typically get a lot of qualifications, and then they decide who's really qualified, and maybe then they reach out to those 3 or 5 or 7 firms and ask for a proposal. So that's number one. Then there's a request for proposal I talked about in a minute. And then there's sort of this in between that they say it's a request for qualifications, but it's really like a mini proposal because they want a statement of understanding, they want a work plan, they even want a budget or an estimated budget. So it's not quite a proposal, but it's kind of in between, and we see a lot of those. It says RFQ, but it's more than RFQ. And the problem if you go after an RFQ or an RFQ plus is sometimes you don't do as much due diligence there. Say, oh, it's just an RFQ, we'll put it together and then get more into it. you've already invested time and think, well, we're not sure we want to work with this client. They don't really know what they're doing, but we've already invested time. Let's continue on in the process. So once you submit an RFQ, I think you do a go, no go, even in an RFQ, but some people that I work with don't. They say, well, if it's an RFQ, we should obviously go after, we can make the decision later. I'd rather make the decision early. And then in the proposal, it's kind of tricky. So there have been cases where we put in our best idea for a proposal and some really innovative stuff in the proposal, and the client hired somebody else at a lower cost or for whatever reason, but then they took out of our scope our idea and gave it to the firm that they selected. They might have done that with others as well. So you maybe don't want to put all your best ideas in the proposal. You want to put kind of an outline and put like a sampling of things in the proposal. And I would say save your best ideas for the interview, if they're doing interviews, and say, and here's what we're going to do, kind of tease it in the proposal. And then at the interview, tell them what you're going to do and sell it at the interview. Because if they do interviews, they're going to forget some of the things in the proposal. So that would be my suggestion. And I don't always follow that suggestion though.
Thank you. Do you establish a different rate structure, lower for nonprofits rather than simply providing pro bono services? And do you say so? You know, if a nonprofit is requesting services, you know, do you mention even in your proposal that this is a lowered rate specifically for nonprofits? Or community groups, whatever.
Because if you give a discount, and I've done that and we've done that, but if you give a discount, everybody's going to find out about it, or a lot of people find out about, well, you gave this firm or organization a discount, I want the same discount, so I guess be aware of that. But there could be cases where it's a really important project, and so like MKSK has a set aside of pro bono work to go after projects like in Akron, where you're from, Christine, or other places, and there's certain projects that are really important to us, and we will pro bono some of the services for that. We have a community impact studio to do some of that work. I worked with a crime firm that the lead would just offer his work pro bono, and he'd say, in addition to all this, and he would save it for the interview and say, in addition to all this, I'm going to put 100 hours in, or whatever it is, pro bono. I'm not going to bill my time, but you're going to get my knowledge. So you would have to decide. You could be different rate structures. Some places would give a lower rate for ongoing work compared to project work, because once you're in ongoing, you do a good job. You don't have to keep submitting a proposal, or they might give a lower fee to a nonprofit, or they might raise the fee. If you're working for a developer or an attorney, if public sector work can be stressful, working for a developer can be very, very stressful. And so a lot of organizations will charge a higher rate if you're doing expert witnessing or working for a developer, because there's no fluff in that time. Every time it's billable, they're going to be questioning every hour, every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes. So you might have a higher rate for that type of work. So depending on the size of the firm and the community and so forth, you might have like a lower cost rate, a typical rate, and then maybe a higher cost rate for a developer, or big like transportation projects or something where you can, basically the market would let you charge a higher rate.
This next question I actually had thought of originally, and then someone asked it. So I actually come from the private sector. That's all. I've never worked for the public sector. And we've had this happen a few times where we happen to be looking for examples for something, and we're looking in a community zoning code and go, wait a minute, those are our images from a different code. Wait a second. Or, you know, we're looking at comp plans and go, that's our language verbatim. Wait a second. So at what point is it ethically okay for like one community to just nab your diagrams or your photos or your text from another? And is it worth, like, do you go after them? What do? Do you just kind of like slough it off? Or, you know, do you make a point to say when you have an agreement with the community that, you know, your work is your work and don't share it with others? Even, I mean, obviously it's public, but what do you do about the whole plagiarism thing?
Yes, this would be my own personal observation from working at different firms and stuff. So this happens a lot. Like years ago, I did a presentation on good landscape architecture standards. It had some really good graphics. And for the next 7 years, I saw those graphics appearing in plans and codes from others. And we found after we did it, we thought, oh, we have an error in the graphic, and we corrected the error, but nobody else knew it. And so the graphic everybody used had errors in it. So we knew that they had just taken it out of an APA presentation. Andres Dwani or DPC has tried to copyright their plans, to do that. And at least in Michigan, we have the Open Meetings Act and so forth. You can't copyright things that are giving, it's public sector work. So as soon as you put that into the zoning ordinance, it's available to others. You put the graphic in, it's available to others. We've tried to copyright graphics here and there. But I think that that's the kind of the downside of consulting is once it's out in the public, somebody else can use that graphic or use that text. I've done zoning ordinances where I said, hey, this parking section looks just like what I wrote, and oh, look, they even have it says city, and this was done for county. So they took it right out of my code, and they didn't even change the community name. So.
If I could chip in just a little bit here, there are liability issues when someone takes your deliverable and misuses it or applies it in a way that wasn't originally contemplated. And there should be language in your consultant agreement to protect you from that issue.
That's a good one. And kind of related to that in a way is working for a developer that could take your report and kind of modify it. So one thing that put in a lot of our agreement is our letters can't be modified by you. Yes, we'll give you the letter or PDF or something, but you can't modify or extract some of our recommendations. Since here's what our planner says without using the whole thing. And I haven't tried that with a community because they haven't had it come up as well, but that could be another thing, as Steve said, you could put in the contracts.
Thank you. And this is for either one of you. Do you now or have you ever dabbled in expert witness testimony or reports? And do you have any comments on it?
So I'll start.
I love it. Because the rules of evidence are more confining than public testimony. So you get all nervous, but you get in there and there's so many things they can't do to you in a legal proceeding that they can do to you in a public meeting. It's almost a relief. But that's my gut reaction. Brad, you can respond more substantively.
I've been expert witness quite a bit, mostly on zoning cases, and about half the time for developer, half the time for the community. I've had at least a dozen times where both the developer's attorney and the community attorney both called me to ask me to be their expert. And so I've had the fortune of becoming the facilitator, where I said, you're both interested, why don't I work with like an attorney and we'll help facilitate. And you have to be careful because there's scrupulous and unscrupulous developers, and then there's communities that make good decisions and defendable decisions, and there's other communities that make very questionable decisions. So the downside of expert witnessing is you can be called to testify in a position you don't fully agree with, whether it's for the developer or the public sector. So I think expert witnessing, you just need to know about that going in. If you go through depositions, there's nothing harder that I can think of than going through a deposition. Especially if you're on the public side and you have the developer. I've been in a room with 6 attorneys on the developer side just grilling me for like 8 straight hours, and I was worn out and waiting for you to make a mistake and stuff. So you really got to be prepared when you're doing deposition or courtroom testimony. But I would say I love being involved in litigation and being on the stand in front of a judge. Depositions are harder, but in the courtroom, I think it's fine, but you really need to be prepared and know the background. But anyway, that's kind of my take.
Also, if you're an expert witness for a community organization, make sure they pay you up front.
Pay you up front, especially a community organization. Yeah, good tip.
Liability insurance. Should you have it? When do you need it? How do you get it? even if it's just you and you're, just a limited, an LCC or just, one person show versus if you have a staff of 10. Where does that come in?
I think it's essential. I'll defer to Brad. He's got broader experience, but in my view, one thing, if you're going to sub for an architecture or engineering firm, they're not going to want to contract with you unless you can cover your end of it as far as liability. And sometimes you have to raise your limits to match the limits that are expected from your prime. But I wouldn't feel comfortable without having some form of liability insurance based on my own experience.
Yeah,
I've never had a claim. I just want to have that protection.
Yeah, I think it depends on your organization and so forth, but like Steve, I think everywhere I've worked, we had liability insurance because you're taking on a risk. So if you're working full-time somewhere and you're doing a consultant on the side, there's a cost of liability insurance, but you might want, if you're working with another firm, make sure you're covered by their liability insurance, or if you're consulting to community, sometimes they will cover you. But you got a big risk if you don't have liability insurance and you're not being covered by somebody else. Just be, cognizant of the risk. We had a session earlier this day, these monthly PPD conversations, and one of them that Steve led and somebody from APA, all on liability insurance and how to get it. So if there's interest in that, we could run that again, because the session that we ran, and I thought I knew all about liability insurance, I learned a lot from this new session and new speakers and new perspectives. So I think that would be a good topic to, if there's interest, I think that would be another topic to repeat.
Tips and tricks for going in on a proposal with another organization, either as the prime or the sub. Best practices, your worst nightmares that you've seen on either being a prime or a sub, working with another firm, or even just a one person helping out. What do you have for us?
So I've been a prime or sub on a lot of things. So my personal experience would be kind of like building these trusted client relations, because somebody I've worked with before says, we want you on a team, or can we team up with you on this? And I've worked with them before. It's kind of like when you said the planner goes to another community. I don't need a lot of detail, like whatever you need me to do and so forth. But if I haven't worked with them, then I want to have a scoping agreement up front. Here's generally what the scope's going to be. Here's generally the fee range. Here's what we need. And why do you do that? Because my worst nightmare is you ask for me. I put a lot of effort in on a proposal with a prime and give them a lot of insight and so forth. And then they get to work and they say, well, they don't give you the work. You win the project, get excited, and then you don't do any of the work. You do maybe a little bit, and then they kind of cast you aside, or they use you to build a relationship with the client. You've got great client relations. They use you to get the work, and then they don't have you do anything or very little. So that would be my nightmare, and this is why we get a teaming agreement, almost like a pre-agreement, and say, we're going to do this. This is the fee. This is the expectation. Legally, you're maybe not bound, but it puts them maybe on a little bit more notice of what the expectations are, or that if you're going to be dismissed from the project, we want it from the client, not from the prime.
And I would recommend against teaming up with more than one consultant on a proposal. It's just very perilous when you do that. It's just much safer to be on one team than to try to game the system and be on 3 or 4 teams.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that too. I think we get asked to be exclusive anyway, and you put in extra effort and so forth. The only exception might be if you're the only expert on something and everybody wants you on the team. I've got a couple projects where the client told everybody going after it, we want Brad Strader on your team, so we would be on every team. But ordinarily, plus there's a lot of work. You think, oh, it's not that much work to be on 4 teams. It's 4 times the work, and everybody wants your knowledge and so forth. So try to pick the best team to be on and win. The downside of that is they have a bad interview, or they switch project managers, or the client doesn't like them. So there's a downside of being exclusive to a team. So try to be selective. I'm not sure there's a hard and fast rule, but my preference is to be exclusive as well. So.
Sleep better.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I just said you sleep better at night if you're exclusive.
Oh. Have you ever gone after anyone who didn't pay you for the services that were due to you? Have you ever taken anyone to court?
So for me, I've not had that ever happen. I've been maybe lucky, but always been paid for everything I had. Maybe in my career, a couple of people say, can we get a discount here? I want to negotiate something, but I haven't had anybody not agree to pay me. So I haven't had to go. MKSK maybe has, I don't know, maybe Steve, you have, but I know you have to make a decision if it's worth going after or not. So.
I think it's going after someone who doesn't pay you is kind of like putting down a pet dog or something. It might be necessary, but it's very distasteful, and it's not something you want to do. I've done it, and I'm not sure I should have done it.
This is why maybe having a retainer with a developer community, some kind of a retainer or something to fall back on, why an informal arrangement can be a problem versus a formal arrangement. At least you've got some leverage to try to go after them or negotiate. So.
Have you ever gone in on a project with like your closest competitor?
Yes.
Got it.
And how does that work? Does it work?
So
would you do it again?
So for me, if you like the people, it's all about personal relationships to me. And if you're a competitor, they offer something you don't offer, or we don't, both of us are too busy, why don't we team up? So we've gone after several things and very enjoyable. And there's probably people at both firms that are saying, why are we teaming up? But on a personal level, we really like working together. We kind of agree on splitting up the responsibilities. And we also thought if we go in together, who's going to beat us? It'd be hard for anybody to beat us. And we'd rather have a pretty good shot of winning it teamed up with them than competing with them. So.
Well, there are people you like to compete with, and there are people you despise. And I would never team with someone I despised.
Right. It would only be people that you really enjoy working with. Right.
Okay.
I've done both.
Let's see if there's any other questions coming in here. Let's see. This question, it says, how do you feel about one-on-one meetings with elected officials?
So I have mostly avoided one-on-one meetings, except maybe with the mayor or something at a meeting, but there have been some projects I've worked on where they want us to meet individually with council members or small groups of council members to just get down to their questions and so forth. So I think if those are formalized, it's good. I think the informal ones are kind of a little bit shaky. I guess it depends on the situation, but I haven't had that come up a lot. It's usually been the community said, well, you go meet with them in small groups or something and find out what their issues are and help facilitate so that they, if they're afraid to ask something at a public meeting or so forth. So I think that's fine. We've had a few communities over the years where individual council members will call me up or call one of the colleagues I work with up and want to share their ideas. Each one of those is kind of tricky to deal with. We usually will take the call and say, in the future, this needs to go through the planning director, the project manager. We have to have open and transparent communications and so forth. So yeah, I think each situation comes up. If they start calling you individually and you answer the call, then they're going to expect that all the time, and you're going to be into scope creep. Whereas like if a resident starts calling you, then other residents start calling you. So you need to know when to say, I'm sorry, you'll have to go through the city manager. If you want to meet at City Hall, we could meet at City Hall along with the planner or something. So if you're going to have these conversations, try to put it on a formal turf instead of informal conversation. So.
Yeah, I've had very regretful relationships with individual elected officials. I would caution against going down that road. It would be much preferable if you're going to meet with an individual elected official, you should have your point of contact with you and make sure that you don't say anything that might get back or that you wouldn't want your point of contact to hear, because he will.
Okay, I have two quick questions left, and I'm gonna do, I think, the most important one first in case we run out of time. So Brad, I know you're AICP. Steve, what are you? Are you?
I got an F in front of my AICP.
He just got an
Steve,
award this year. Congratulations to Steve. So,
Thank you.
congratulations. So for those on the line that might know, APA has some credentials, AICP, American Institute of Certified Planners. And then if you're Steve, you're the rock star where you are a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners. So AICP, you have to meet some credentials in terms of education and in terms of work history. You have to take an exam. You have to write some essays, and to become a fellow, you spend like a solid year of your life documenting on paper everything that you've done up until that point in your career. Get a bunch of people to write awesome letters for you, and that is it's a very prestigious recognition. So anyway, my point of this is it important to have AICP as a private planner? I gotta tell you, like I said, I come from the private sector and I was one of a few that got AICP, and a lot of folks said, it didn't really, at least at that time, this was like 15 years ago when I left to do this, it just wasn't, as long as one person on the team was AICP, it was okay. What say both of you in terms of whether or not it's important for a private planner to have the credential?
I think it's essential. As a consultant, you're competing with registered professional engineers and licensed architects and all that stuff, and the least you can claim is AICP, and you should take it. A lot of people think planners are, well, some engineering firms, none that I would care to name, will engage in strategic hires where someone is retired or just left the Department of Transportation. And they say, okay, well, you're not an engineer, we'll make you a planner. You need to distinguish yourself from those so-called planners who are really there just for marketing or to attract clients. I think the APA is consciously doing more to establish the credential of AICP, and however much they do, they need to do even more than that. In Florida, the FDOT recognizes AICP along with PE as a qualifying credential. I worked in Tennessee, and the Tennessee DOT didn't do that. And there are a lot of times that the work was reserved for a professional engineer, and I don't think that's fair. Some people think traffic studies need to be stamped by a professional engineer, and I think that's BS.
I think I would probably echo Steve. So earlier in my career, AICP didn't seem to mean very much. I thought, do I even need the initial, even have my business card? Nobody, only a very few RFPs asked for AICP. But in the last decade or so, I think it's become more important because there's been more scrutiny from the public. If you have AICP, you get a little bit more recognition and respect from the public. And certainly, as Steve said, the engineers and the attorneys and the architects pay more attention to you if you have AICP or a certified planner. A lot of the calls I get from attorneys and architects, they say, do you have AICP planners here? So we're hearing it more from allied professions. For early half of my career, I hardly ever heard it come up, and I think it's, for whatever reason, APA or others, I think it's become more important now to have that credential. And if you're dealing with PTOEs and PE engineers, and you're dealing with AIA architects and so forth, and registered landscape architects, I think you get more credential, more respect if you have AICP. So.
Okay, last question. We have a couple minutes left. Do you find that it's useful to speak at conferences, workshops, on webinars? Do you get business from this? Is it worth it? Is it a good way to expose you and your companies and what you do and the projects that you've completed? Or is it more I'm just giving back to the planning community?
So for me, it's probably half and half. So I used to do a lot of speaking, and then I got way too much work from speaking. So it did bring in a lot of work, and my colleagues, and I just would have my colleagues would put a note in front of me, no, because somebody would call and say, hey, can you speak at this, speak at that? And like, say no, Brad. And I learned to say no, and I do less speaking than I used to, because it takes up a lot of time. And then you got to get all the work done and so forth. So it has, I mentioned the Alaska thing. So speaking at conferences has certainly helped my reputation and helped me build up my credential and build up work and build up networking. But you don't want to maybe like overdo it. And you have to be careful. The topics that are of interest and can lead to work, I think is also important. So yes, it's been good for me, but I would not let it rule the roost too much. So.
Yeah, I had an experience similar to what Brad described. I went to a conference and it just led one thing to another, to another, to another in terms of work. So it was very lucrative. But I probably had more misses than hits in terms of speaking engagements.
Yeah, I spoke at APA Virginia a few years ago, and it was because I had a friend there that brought me in to speak, and I thought, oh, it's kind of go to Virginia. It was a great time in Williamsburg, and within 10 days, I had 6 communities in Virginia asked me to come and speak and work on things, and I had like, that was the most direct, like 6 projects after one like 30-minute charrette that I ran. So it led to some things.
Okay. Well, thank you both for joining, and thank you for being so candid about the profession and the hits, the misses, the good, the bad, the ugly. So we appreciate your time in doing this, and we appreciate the private practice division of APA. I did put in the chat box there the email address if you would like the handbook, or if you would like to join the division and purchase the handbook. That email address is in the chat. We are recording this, so you can share it with your friends. It'll be up on our YouTube channel sometime on Tuesday, I would suspect. Again, just head over to YouTube and type in Planning Webcast Series. And this session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits. And don't forget to visit our website so that you can register for all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast.
Okay, thank you.
And I think that's it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
So thanks to you, Steve and Brad, and everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you. Bye.